The Threnody Compact had catalogued 11,406 sapient species across its long, orderly expansion through the galaxy. And in all that time, no species had ever required more than a single cycle of observation before the Compact's Ministry of Expansion classified it, filed it, and either absorbed it or, in the rare cases where resistance proved statistically inconvenient, quietly erased it from the star charts. The Compact did not conquer through cruelty. It conquered through certainty, through the crushing, mathematical confidence of a civilization that had reduced conflict itself to an actuarial exercise, and it had never once been wrong about what it found when it looked closely enough at a new world. The Compact's home systems, had any human ever been permitted to see them, would have struck an outside observer as a study in the deliberate, exhaustive elimination of surprise. Threnody cities rose in perfect concentric rings of pale gray stone and glass, their proportions calculated centuries in advance by algorithms that optimized for efficiency of movement and minimization of unnecessary sensory stimulus. Threnody clothing came in a narrow, regulated palette of muted tones, chosen not for beauty, but for their proven capacity to produce the lowest measurable levels of emotional arousal in controlled psychological trials conducted millennia earlier. Threnody music, what little of it survived as a cultural artifact rather than a functional signaling system, consisted of long, even, unhurried tones with no percussive element at all, designed explicitly to soothe rather than to move. Children were assessed from the earliest viable age for any sign of what Threnody developmental science called affective excess, and those who exhibited it, a tendency toward loud laughter, an unusual attachment to a particular object or companion, a visible physical reaction to loss, were placed gently but firmly into a specialized curriculum designed to bring their emotional responses back within the narrow, socially approved range that had defined Threnody civilization for 11,000 years. It was not, by Threnody standards, a cruel system. It was, if anything, considered the highest expression of collective care. A civilization that had decided long ago that the volatility of unmanaged feeling was the single greatest threat to social stability a species could face, and had spent every century since methodically engineering that threat down to a negligible residual risk. Grand Assessor Threl Vantik, who had personally overseen the pacification surveys of 412 worlds over the course of his unnaturally long and unnaturally calm life, did not expect Earth to be any different. He had, in fact, requested the assignment specifically because the preliminary threat rating suggested it would be an uneventful, low-risk posting, the kind of routine survey that would occupy a comfortable interval before his eventual, long-anticipated retirement into the quiet, orderly leisure the Compact reserved for its most decorated servants. The preliminary long-range scans were, if anything, faintly disappointing in their ordinariness. A single inhabited planet, a fractured collection of competing nation-states, a technology base still burning hydrocarbons for the bulk of its energy needs, no unified planetary government, no meaningful space presence beyond a scattering of low-orbit satellites and two crewed stations that qualified charitably as primitive. Vantik's staff ran the standard threat algorithm 3 times, out of procedural habit rather than genuine doubt, and each time it returned the same verdict, printed in the flat, colorless script the Compact used for all official findings. Negligible. Recommend standard observation protocol 17-unit deployment pre-invasion cultural baseline assessment. 17 scouts then. 17 of the Compact's finest, drawn from the Ministry's most decorated infiltration corps, each one a masterwork of Threnody engineering and discipline. Bodies reshaped through generations of selective breeding and late-stage biological correction to pass, at a glance, for the dominant local phenotype. Minds trained from infancy in the Compact's foundational doctrine, which held that emotion was a vestigial malfunction, an evolutionary leftover that advanced civilizations engineered out of themselves the way a healthy body sheds dead skin. The Threnody had not eliminated feeling entirely. Their physiology would not permit that, but they had spent 11,000 years building an entire civilization around its suppression, layering ritual and pharmacology and social conditioning atop it, until the average Threnody citizen experienced something like joy or grief with roughly the intensity of a mild change in room temperature. Noted, catalogued, and set aside. It was, by every metric the compact valued, the pinnacle of civilized existence. Rational, effic. Ain't stable and utterly, permanently predictable. No candidate for the mission had been chosen carelessly. Each of the 17 had passed a selection process that eliminated all but the most rigorously disciplined one in several million Threnody citizens. Individuals whose psychological profiles had been tested, retested, and certified immune to precisely the kind of destabilization the Ministry's own doctrine insisted a pre-spaceflight species could never possibly produce. The 17 scouts descended to Earth's surface in a slow, staggered deployment over the course of 6 weeks, their cloaking fields tuned to the specific atmospheric and electromagnetic signature of the planet, their cover identities constructed with the meticulous, bloodless precision the compact applied to everything. Scout Adept Iren Dassel, designated Scout 1, was among the first to land, touching down in a rain-slicked alley behind a jazz club in New Orleans on a humid October night. Her landing craft folded down into something resembling an abandoned delivery van, her biological disguise settling into the appearance of a quiet, unremarkable woman in her 30s. Her mission parameters were simple: observe, catalog, report. Assess the target species' technological ceiling, its social cohesion, its capacity for organized resistance. File a report every 72 hours. Do not engage emotionally. Do not deviate from protocol. Iren filed her first 6 reports exactly on schedule, and they were models of Threnody discipline. Dry, precise, thick with the kind of quantified observation the Ministry favored: population density figures, traffic pattern analysis, and inventory of visible weapons technology that confirmed again and again the species' primitive military ceiling. It was in her 7th report, filed 11 days after landing, that something in the data began, almost imperceptibly, to drift. She had been assigned to continue her surveillance from a rented room above the jazz club itself, the easiest available vantage point for monitoring foot traffic through the surrounding district, and on the 9th night of that assignment, unable to sleep, a condition her physiology did not typically produce without cause. She had gone downstairs into the club itself, ostensibly to gather additional social pattern data on human recreational gathering behavior. What she found there was a trio of musicians playing something the humans called blues, a form she had encountered only in brief clinical audio samples during her mission preparation. Samples that had been filtered, analyzed, and dismissed by Ministry cultural assessors as primitive rhythmic vocalization, low informational density, negligible strategic relevance. The samples had not prepared her for the actual experience of standing in a small, dim room thick with the smell of bourbon and cigarette smoke and human sweat, the low amber light catching on the brass of a battered trumpet, propped against a chair, condensation sliding down the sides of glasses left forgotten on scarred round tables, the floorboards themselves seeming to carry a low vibration up through the soles of her shoes each time the upright bass found its lowest note. She watched a heavy-set man close his eyes and bend a note on a battered guitar until it seemed to physically ache, the string trembling visibly under his calloused finger, his whole body leaning into the sound as though he were listening to it arrive from somewhere far away rather than producing it himself. And she watched the small crowd around her go quiet and then, without any visible signal or coordination, begin to sway together in a loose, imperfect unity that no Threnody social cohesion algorithm had a category for. She stood in the back of that room for 2 hours and 11 minutes motionless, her internal chronometer running the entire time, cataloging without meaning to the way grief and pleasure seemed to occupy the same note simultaneously in a way her own species' music had spent 11,000 years carefully, deliberately separating. And when she finally returned to her rented room to compose her report, she found that her hands, trained through decades of compact conditioning to move with perfect, unhesitating efficiency, would not stop trembling long enough to type. Her seventh report, when it finally went out, 4 hours later than protocol allowed, contained a paragraph that Grand Assessor Vantik would later read and reread so many times that he had it memorized before the war of attrition against his own certainty had even properly begun. The auditory stimulus, ERN had written, in the flat clinical register the ministry required, produces a physiological response inconsistent with baseline Threnody effect regulation. Recommend further study. Note, unable to fully characterize the response using standard emotional taxonomy, it does not correspond to any category in the ministry's approved lexicon. It is not distress, requesting clarification on protocol for undocumented affect states. The ministry's cultural office, reviewing the report through the ordinary bureaucratic pipeline, flagged it as a minor anomaly, recommended standard psychological recalibration at the scout's next scheduled extraction, and moved on because the compact in 11,000 years of expansion had never once encountered a threat that took the form of a paragraph about a guitar. Scout 3, a broad-shouldered operative named Corwin Hess in his human guise, was deployed to Tokyo, and his undoing came not through music but through food. A category of human experience the ministry's briefing materials had dismissed even more thoroughly than art, describing it in a single line as nutritional intake ritual low strategic value. Monitor for evidence of coordinated resource hoarding. Corwin's downfall began on a rain-swept evening 3 weeks into his deployment, when hunger, an inconvenient but manageable biological signal his training taught him to treat as a maintenance task rather than an experience, led him into a narrow, steam-fogged ramen shop tucked beneath an overpass, the kind of place his surveillance protocols would ordinarily have flagged only for its usefulness as a low-traffic observation post. The shop held only 9 seats, arranged along a single scarred wooden counter, and the air inside was thick and close with rendered pork fat and rising steam, condensation beating on the small, high window and running in slow rivulets down glass fogged amber by the light of a single bare bulb. Somewhere behind the counter, a battered radio played a tinny recording of an old encab ballad, and the elderly proprietor worked without wasted motion, his hands moving through a sequence he had clearly repeated tens of thousands of times, each gesture worn smooth by repetition into something that looked, to Corwin's sensor-augmented eye, almost like a kind of devotion. He ordered, at the elderly proprietor's brusque recommendation, a bowl of tonkatsu ramen, and what arrived in front of him was a small, unremarkable-looking dish that his sensor-augmented palate, engineered for precise chemical analysis of any substance he consumed, a survival feature standard to all Threnody field operatives, immediately began cataloging with clinical thoroughness. Pork bone broth reduced over 18 hours to a milky, collagen-rich density. Noodles of a specific alkaline composition that produced a particular chewing resistance the humans called koshi. A soft-boiled egg whose yolk, when pierced, released a slow, viscous richness that coated the tongue. Scallions, a thin sheet of nari, a few slices of chashu pork rendered down until the fat had gone soft and sweet. His internal chemical analysis completed in under 2 seconds, exactly as designed. What it had not been designed for, what no line of Threnody training had ever prepared him to process, was the second thing that happened as he lifted the first mouthful of noodles and broth to his lips. A full-body response that began somewhere behind his sternum and radiated outward, warm and total. A reaction his internal systems logged with a kind of clinical bewilderment as falling outside every documented parameter of Threnody physiology. The steam rising off the bowl fogged his vision for a moment, and beneath it he could smell, layered one over another, the deep animal richness of the broth, the sharp green bite of scallion, a faint char of sesame oil, and underneath all of it something he could not immediately name and later realized was simply the smell of a small, warm, crowded room on a cold and rainy night. A smell that had nothing to do with the food itself and everything to do with the particular. The specific comfort of being exactly where you were supposed to be. He sat in that ramen shop for 40 minutes, ordering a second bowl, then a third, ignoring the mounting violation of protocol alerts pulsing quietly at the edge of his awareness. And when he finally filed his report that night, it read in part, Subject species has developed a category of experience I am unable to translate into ministry terminology. It is not merely fuel intake. There is a structure to it, a deliberate engineering of pleasure through contrast, heat against cold, fat against acid, softness against resistance, that appears to serve no survival function beyond itself. I have reviewed 11 prior reports from other field operatives referencing similar unclassifiable affect states. Recommend the ministry consider that we may be encountering not a primitive species, but a species that has weaponized experience itself in ways our threat models were not built to detect. The report was flagged, filed, and like ERNs before it, dismissed by a cultural office that had no framework for taking a bowl of ramen seriously as a matter of galactic security. It was Scout 9, a lean, watchful operative named Priya Anand. In no relation to the ensign who would appear in an entirely different chronicle of human resilience, though the ministry's records would later note the coincidence of name with the kind of bemused irrelevance a bureaucracy reserves for facts it cannot use, who first encountered human visual art, and whose reports, more than any other scouts, would later be cited by ministry historians as the true beginning of the compact's unraveling. Anand's human identity was that of an unassuming museum security contractor in Amsterdam, a cover chosen for its excellent surveillance access to the city's transit and communications infrastructure. It was, ironically, the very cover designed to make her invisible that placed her, night after night, alone in the darkened galleries of the Van Gogh Museum after closing, walking her assigned patrol routes past canvases she had been trained to regard as nothing more than pigment arranged on cloth. A primitive species crude attempt at visual documentation before the invention of reliable imaging technology. The painting that ended Scout 9's career as a Threnody operative was a small, unassuming study of a wheat field beneath a turbulent sky, painted in the last months of a human artist's life by a man who had, she later learned from a placard she read 7 times over 3 separate nights, taken his own life not long after completing it. She stood in front of that painting on the 14th night of her patrol rotation, the gallery's emergency lighting throwing long, faint shadows across the polished floor, the building around her utterly silent except for the low hum of the climate system that kept the old canvases from cracking, and found herself unable to move for 11 minutes, staring at the thick, urgent ridges of paint, at the way the sky churned with a violence that had no photographic equivalent. Thick swirling strokes of blue and black laid on so heavily that individual bristle marks were still visible in the dried paint. At the crows scattered black across the gold of the wheat like a held breath about to break. 3 converging paths cutting through the field toward some vanishing point the painter had refused to resolve. And she understood, with a clarity that her ministry training had no vocabulary to contain, that she was looking at a species attempt to make grief and beauty occupy the same physical object at once, and that it had succeeded so completely that 11,000 years of Threnody civilization, for all its wormhole engineering and its planetary-scale terraforming and its endless catalog of 11,400 subjugated worlds, had never once produced anything that came close. Her report that week was the first to explicitly recommend a change in compact classification. I submit, she wrote, in language that violated at least 4 separate protocols governing appropriate register for field communications, that this species has not failed to develop advanced technology. I submit that it has developed a technology we do not have a category for because it is not built from matter or energy but from feeling, and it appears to propagate between individuals with an efficiency that our own emotional suppression architecture may be catastrophically unequipped to resist. I am requesting immediate psychological evaluation. I do not trust my own judgment at this time. I do not want to stop observing. I am afraid of what that means. It was the word, afraid, appearing for the first time in 11,000 years of ministry field reports in a document filed by an active duty scout, that finally moved the anomaly from the cultural office's low-priority queue into the direct attention of Grand Assessor Vantik himself. Scout 12, a wiry, restless operative named Orrin Fask, who had spent the first 3 weeks of his deployment monitoring a mid-sized city in the human region called the Midwest, fell not to a single overwhelming encounter, but to what his own reports, in retrospect, described as a slow erosion, 1,000 small cuts delivered by a species that seemed, almost carelessly, to have built joy into the smallest crevices of its daily existence. His cover identity required him to spend several evenings a week at a nondescript sports bar near his assigned surveillance post. Chosen for its excellent vantage point over a stretch of municipal infrastructure, the ministry had flagged as a potential resistance staging area, a place of sticky floors and flickering neon beer signs, and the constant low roar of a dozen overlapping conversations competing with 3 mounted screens. It was there, watching a room full of ordinary, exhausted, economically precarious humans lose their collective composure over a football game whose outcome had no bearing whatsoever on their survival, their resources, or their strategic position in any framework the Compact recognized, that Orrin first began to understand something his training had never prepared him to nom. That humans had built entire elaborate systems of meaning around events with no material stakes at all, simply for the pleasure of the feeling those systems produced, and that the intensity of that feeling, the way a room of strangers could embrace each other, weep, scream in unison at the flight of a ball across a patch of painted grass, bore no relationship whatsoever to its practical consequences. He began attending the games not for surveillance purposes, but because, as he wrote in a report the ministry's cultural office would later cite as a textbook case of cascading effective compromise, he had discovered that losing himself in a shared, meaningless, temporary drama with a room full of strangers produced a sensation of belonging that no Threnody civic ritual, for all its precision and order, had ever once approximated. By his 9th week on Earth, Orrin Fask had learned to name every player on the city's professional team, had acquired a jersey he wore inexplicably even when off duty, and had begun to weep openly without shame surrounded by strangers doing the same, when that team won a championship for the first time in 31 years, an event that produced across the entire city a spontaneous, unplanned eruption of dancing, shouting, embracing joy that lasted, by his own careful chronometer measurement, into the small hours of the following morning. I do not have a category for what I experienced tonight, his final coherent report read. It was not strategically significant. It changed nothing material about this city's resources or capabilities, and it was, without question or comparison, the single most alive I have ever felt in 106 years of Threnody existence. I recommend, ministry willing, that someone finally ask why that might be true, rather than continuing to file it as irrelevant. Scout 14's undoing came through an even less dignified channel by Threnody standards, human comedy. Assigned to monitor a comedy club in Chicago as a low-priority surveillance post, she designated in ministry files only as Scout 14, her chosen human name Marla Voss, had approached her first several weeks of observation with the same clinical detachment every other scout had initially maintained, cataloging audience laughter patterns as a potential indicator of social cohesion and stress response, exactly as her mission brief instructed. It was on the 16th night of her assignment, watching a young comedian work through a set about the specific absurd humiliation of being an adult who still could not correctly assemble flat-pack furniture, that Marla Voss experienced, for the first time in her adult life, an involuntary physical response so total and so uncontrollable that she nearly compromised her cover on the spot. She laughed suddenly and completely, a full-bodied, undignified eruption that doubled her over in her seat and left her, afterward, disoriented and faintly ashamed in a way she could not fully account for, because nothing about the joke itself had been, by any Threnody standard, remotely threatening or destabilizing. It was simply devastatingly funny, and funny, she realized in the weeks that followed, was a weapon the Compact had no shield for at all, because it did not attack through fear or desire but through the sudden, disarming recognition of shared, ordinary absurdity. And once you had felt it, really felt it, all the way down, some part of you never fully closed back up again. By the time Vantik began his personal review of the 17 scouts' accumulated reports, 9 of them had already stopped transmitting entirely, their tracking beacons still active, still broadcasting from fixed locations across the human world. A narrow apartment above a jazz club in New Orleans, a ramen shop's back room in Tokyo, a small rented flat 3 streets from the Van Gogh Museum, a sports bar with a championship jersey still hanging on a hook by its door. A comedy club where Marla Voss had by then taken a part-time job behind the bar simply to be present for the laughter every night. But the scouts themselves silent, their scheduled check-ins simply, quietly unmet. Vantik's staff initially assumed capture or malfunction, or the kind of catastrophic operational failure the Compact's threat models occasionally predicted even for the most negligible targets. It was only when a routine surveillance drone, dispatched to investigate Scout One's abandoned beacon, captured passive audio and visual data of Iren Dassel sitting cross-legged on the floor of that same jazz club, cloaking field deactivated, dressed in human clothing, laughing, actually laughing, an act her body had not performed once in the 4 decades of her ministry service prior to that night. While an elderly human woman taught her to play a 12-bar blues progression on a battered upright piano, that the true scale of the problem became impossible to file away as a minor anno. Molly. Vantik watched that footage 11 times before he was willing to accept what it showed him. He had spent 412 pacification campaigns building an unshakable professional conviction that Threnody discipline was, quite simply, incorruptible, that the 11,000-year architecture of emotional suppression built into every citizen from birth represented an evolutionary and cultural achievement so total that no external stimulus from a negligible pre-spaceflight species could possibly threaten it. And yet here was Scout Adept Iren Dassel, decorated, disciplined, chosen from thousands of candidates for precisely her unshakable adherence to protocol, sitting on a jazz club floor with her cloaking field switched off and her carefully constructed emotional armor lying somewhere on the ground beside her, learning a 12-bar blues progression with the focused, joyful intensity of someone discovering, for the first time in her entire adult life, that experience could be something other than data to be logged. The ministry's response when it finally came was the deployment of a second wave. Not scouts this time, but a full retrieval team and Vantik himself, dispatched personally by an assembly that had begun, for the first time in living memory, to use the word contagion in its internal communications about a supposedly primitive target world. Vantik's own briefing, delivered before his departure by the ministry's chief cultural analyst, a nervous, precise woman named Asya Rel who had spent the preceding weeks reading and rereading all 17 scouts' complete reports until her own sleep patterns had begun alarmingly to fragment, contained a warning that Vantik dismissed in that first briefing as bureaucratic overcaution. Grand Assessor, Rel told him, I do not believe we are dealing with a psychological weakness in our field operatives. I believe we are dealing with an emergent property of human culture itself, art, music, food, narrative, the thing they call humor that functions functionally as a kind of cognitive infection, one that our suppression architecture was never designed to resist because it does not attack the mind through force. It attacks through invitation. It offers something our own culture spent 11,000 years learning to consider unnecessary. And it turns out that unnecessary and undesirable are not the same thing at all. Vantik landed on Earth's surface 6 weeks later, in a private, heavily shielded vessel disguised as a mid-altitude weather research craft, touching down in a remote stretch of desert outside a city the humans called Los Angeles, chosen for its proximity to the largest concentration of defected scouts. 5 of the original 17 had by that point relocated independently to the same sprawling, chaotic metropolis, drawn, according to the last coherent reports any of them had filed, by what one scout's final transmission described only as the density of stories per square kilometer. Asya Rel, the ministry's chief cultural analyst who had first warned Vantik that the compact might be facing something closer to a contagion than a conventional threat, had not accompanied him to the planet's surface. Her role by ministry design was to remain aboard the orbital relay station, monitoring the mission from what her superiors believed was a position of total analytical safety, insulated from any direct exposure to the anomaly she had spent months studying only through filtered second-hand reports. It was, in retrospect, a design flaw the ministry would spend years trying to understand, because Rel's insulation proved to be no insulation at all. The Threnody Assembly's own reaction to the accumulating field reports in the weeks before Vantik's departure had been one of the few genuine institutional crises the Compact had faced in a millennium. Convened in emergency session in the vast, echoing chamber at the heart of the homeworld's capital, a space built entirely of pale stone and cool, indirect light specifically to discourage anything resembling heated debate, the Assembly's senior counselors found themselves, for the first time any of them could recall, unable to reach the swift procedural consensus that had defined every prior compact decision of consequence. Several counselors argued for an immediate, overwhelming military response, a fleet dispatched not to invade but to erase, on the theory that a threat which could not be contained should simply be removed from existence before its contagion spread any further through the ranks of any future Threnody personnel who might be exposed to it. Others, more cautious, argued that the reports themselves might represent a psychological weapon deployed deliberately by the humans, a possibility the Assembly's own intelligence division found almost immediately implausible, given that nothing in 17 Scouts' worth of accumulated data suggested humanity was even aware that it was under Threnody observation at all, let alone sophisticated enough to engineer a weapon built from the accidental, indiscriminate beauty of its own culture. It was this second faction, ultimately, that carried the argument for restraint, not because the Assembly had grown compassionate, but because its own military analysts could not, in good conscience, certify that any invasion force sent to erase the threat would return uncompromised. And a compact that had built its entire 11,000-year existence on certainty was not prepared to gamble an entire war fleet on an enemy whose only demonstrated capability was making its enemies unwilling to fight it. It was this same uncertainty, communicated back to Vantik in a terse, unusually hesitant directive from the Assembly that finally sent him to Los Angeles alone, tasked not with retrieval but with the far harder and far more dangerous mission of simply understanding, well enough to explain it to a body of counselors who had never once in their long institutional lives encountered a problem their algorithms could not solve. She had, over the course of her research, absorbed nearly the entirety of the 17 Scouts' recovered audio and visual logs, the blues recordings, the ramen shop's ambient noise, fragments of the wheat field painting captured on a Scout's optical sensor, entire recorded film screenings salvaged from Vantik's own increasingly erratic surveillance uploads, and she had absorbed them not as raw intelligence data, the way ministry protocol required but slowly, helplessly. As a person absorbing a language she had not known she was fluent in until she found herself already speaking it. It was a film that finally broke her, transmitted up from the surface as part of Vantik's own compromised reporting, a black-and-white human picture from the middle of the last century about an ordinary man who believes, on the worst night of his life, that the world would have been better off without him, and is shown, by a minor and unglamorous supernatural intervention, exactly how wrong he is. Rel watched it alone in her quarters aboard the orbital station, transmitted at low resolution across a signal never designed to carry entertainment media, and she watched it not once but 4 times over the following 2 weeks. And by the 4th viewing she was weeping in a manner her own physiology should not have permitted so easily, and she found that she no longer particularly cared what that fact implied about her fitness for continued ministry service. Her final report to the Assembly, filed the same week Vantik composed his own unsent confession, was 3 sentences long, I have reviewed the totality of the available evidence regarding the target species' cultural output. I no longer believe I am capable of providing an objective threat assessment, because I no longer wish for the assessment I would give honestly to result in this world's destruction. Recommend the Assembly select a replacement analyst who has not yet watched the films. Vantik's own cover identity on the planet's surface was that of a reclusive foreign investor, wealthy enough to move through the city's more exclusive spaces without drawing undue attention, disciplined enough, he told himself, that the fate of his 17 scouts would not befall him. He had spent 412 campaigns cultivating a mind that treated emotional stimulus the way a sealed vault treats a lockpick, acknowledged, catalogued, and denied entry. He did not believe a species that still burned petroleum for transportation could breach that vault. He was, within 11 days of landing, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. His first contact with Scout 9, Priya Anand, the museum guard whose report on the wheat field painting had first used the word afraid, took place in a small, unglamorous coffee shop in a neighborhood the humans called Silver Lake, chosen by Vantik's retrieval planning team as a low-risk location for an extraction attempt that would not, they believed, require force, because Threnody protocol held that any operative could be recalled to duty through the simple, unanswerable authority of direct ministry command. The shop itself was nothing his mission briefing had prepared him to take seriously. A narrow, sun-warmed room with mismatched wooden chairs, the low hiss and clatter of an espresso machine working through its morning rhythm, the smell of roasted coffee thick enough to feel like a physical presence in the air, a hand-lettered chalkboard menu that listed drinks with names his translation matrix struggled to render sensibly. He noted with the same clinical thoroughness his training demanded of every environment, the exposed brick, the mismatched art on the walls, student work, unremarkable by any ministry cultural metric, and yet arranged with a kind of careless, deliberate warmth that no Threnody public space had ever once attempted, and the low mew. Arremer of a dozen ordinary human conversations happening at once, none of them coordinated, none of them monitored, an entire small ecosystem of unguarded feeling humming along in the background of what was, to every appearance, an utterly unremarkable morning. Anand arrived at the meeting looking, to Vantik's clinical assessment, physically unwell by Threnody standards. She had gained a small amount of weight, her hair had grown past regulation length. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes that suggested an alarming frequency of the specific facial movement humans called smiling. And she listened without argument to the entirety of his formal recall order, delivered in the flat, procedural Threnody dialect reserved for command communications. Before she answered him not with the expected compliance, but with a question. "Have you ever heard Nina Simone sing Feeling Good?" she asked him. And when Vantik, thrown by the total non sequitur of the response, said that he had not, she reached across the small table between them, tapped something on the surface of the device the humans called a phone, and set it down between their 2 cups of coffee, his untouched, hers half-finished. A beverage his sensors had already flagged as containing a mild stimulant alkaloid of no particular strategic interest. What emerged from the small device was a human voice, low and rich and unhurried, moving through a melody that built phrase by phrase from a spare, almost hesitant opening into something that swelled unmistakably into triumph. A horn section entering beneath the voice like sunrise arriving all at once instead of gradually. And Vantik's own suppression architecture, honed over 412 campaigns and 11,000 years of institutional discipline, had absolutely no defense against it. Because it did not attack him. It simply sat there in the space between them, existing, offering itself, asking nothing, and Vantik found himself, 3 minutes and 41 seconds later, staring at the surface of his untouched coffee with an expression his own facial monitoring subroutines, still running out of pure institutional habit, logged as unclassified, high-intensity, duration ongoing. "That's the thing your species never planned for," Anand told him quietly once the song had ended and the coffee shop's ordinary ambient noise, the hiss of a milk steamer, a fragment of unrelated human conversation 2 tables away, the scrape of a chair had reasserted itself around them. "You built a civilization that treats feeling like a design flaw, but feeling isn't a flaw, grand assessor. It's the whole point. It's the only reason any of this, She gestured loosely at the coffee shop, at the street outside its windows, at the whole sprawling, chaotic, luminous mess of human civilization beyond it was ever worth building in the first place. You came here to assess whether we were a threat. I don't think you're going to be able to answer that question honestly once you understand what you're actually looking at. We're not a threat because we can hurt you. We're a threat because we can show you what you gave up. And once you've seen it, you can't file it away and pretend you didn't. She told him over the following hour about the rest of her own unraveling, details that had never made it into any of her official reports because there had come a point, she admitted, where she had simply stopped filing reports that told the truth. She told him about the taste of mangoes in July, bought from a cart 2 blocks from her apartment, so sweet and overripe that the juice ran down her wrist, and she had licked it away without a trace of the fastidiousness her training had once demanded of her. She told him about learning to dance badly, on purpose, at a friend's wedding, surrounded by people who did not care that she moved with none of the practiced grace her Threnody physical conditioning could have easily provided if she had let it. Because the point of the dancing, she had come to understand, was never the precision of the movement but the shared, unguarded joy of moving badly together. She told him about grief too, because she had let herself feel that as well, the whole unbearable weight of it. When the elderly proprietor of a small bookstore she frequented had died quietly in his sleep, and she had cried for a man who was not her kin, not her clan, not anyone the Compact's kinship algorithms would have recognized as worth her sorrow, and had found that the crying, however much it hurt, had also made her feel more fully alive than 11,000 years of Threnody emotional discipline ever once had. Vantik did not recall Scout 9 that day. He told himself, in the report he filed that night, a report he would later revise 4 times before finally, weeks later, choosing not to file it at all, that he required additional observation time to properly assess the scope of the anomaly before recom. Mending a ministry-wide response. It was, he knew even as he wrote it, the same rationalization Eren Dassel had used in her 7th report. The same slow, self-justifying drift that had carried 9 of his 17 scouts from disciplined observation into full defection. And he wrote it anyway because some part of him, a part his own architecture had no framework for identifying, did not want the observation period to end. Over the following 3 weeks, Vantik's own reports to the ministry grew steadily shorter, steadily less precise, and steadily more preoccupied with details that no grand assessor in the history of the Compact had ever thought worth including in an official threat assessment. He described in one report an evening spent in a small revival cinema in a neighborhood full of used bookshops and taquerias, watching a black-and-white human film from the previous century about a detective who never found what he was looking for. And he found himself, in the darkness of that theater, experiencing something his own internal monitoring systems logged as a sustained, low-grade ache that persisted for 2 full days afterward, an ache he found himself. Against every instinct his training had ever instilled in him, unwilling to make stop. He described in another report the specific sensory experience of eating a taco from a cart parked outside a hardware store at 11 at night, the charred, smoky sweetness of the meat against the bright acid of lime and salsa. And he noted, with the same clinical bewilderment Corwin Hess had recorded weeks earlier over a bowl of ramen, that the experience had produced in him a sensation he could only describe as gratitude, a category of effect the Threnody language did not, strictly speaking, contain a native word for, forcing him to borrow the human term directly into his report, untranslated because no equivalent existed. The retrieval team Vantik had brought with him, 6 operatives, handpicked for their unimpeachable discipline, chosen specifically because ministry psychological assessors had flagged them as the personnel least likely to succumb to whatever effective anomaly had already claimed 9 of the original 17 scouts, began, one by one, over the course of that same 3 weeks, to exhibit the identical pattern. Retrieval operative Kesu Bran, assigned to monitor the city's downtown financial district for signs of coordinated human resistance activity, instead found himself spending his surveillance hours in the cheap seats of a small, unair-conditioned theater watching amateur productions of human musicals, and filed a report, eventually, that consisted of nothing but a detailed, four-page analysis of why the closing number of a show about a group of humans trying to save their community theater from demolition had made him weep, an act his body had never once performed in 140 years of disciplined Threnody service. For 11 consecutive minutes in a dark theater surrounded by strangers who did not know or care that he was not technically human at all. Vantik convened his remaining loyal staff, 3 retrieval operatives, out of the original 6 who had not yet, by his last assessment, crossed whatever invisible threshold separated disciplined observation from full defection, for an emergency strategy session held in the sterile, climate-controlled interior of his weather research cover vessel, its curved metal walls and cold blue instrument light a stark, almost aggressive contrast to the warm chaos of the city sprawled beyond its shielded hull. The tactical display at the center of the room showed, in flat, colorless light, the last known locations of all 17 original scouts and all 6 retrieval operatives, a constellation of small dots scattered across the human world, each one a marker of a Threnody life that had quietly, irreversibly chosen a jazz club or a ramen shop or a subway platform over 11,000 years of institutional certainty. And it was there, standing in front of that display, that Vantik finally fully articulated the shape of the crisis the Compact was facing. "We did not send scouts to a primitive world," he told the 3 remaining loyal operatives, his voice, even to his own ears, carrying a strain his training had never once permitted before. "We sent scouts into an ecosystem of feelings so dense, so total, that our own architecture of suppression, the thing we have spent 11,000 years perfecting, the thing that makes us who we are, turns out to be nothing more than a dam built to hold back a trickle, deployed against an ocean. Every human artifact we've cataloged as primitive, their music, their food, their paintings, their absurd, sprawling, undisciplined stories, is not a symptom of underdevelopment. It is a technology. It is the single most sophisticated technology this species has ever built, more sophisticated than anything in our own arsenal, because it does not need to break through our defenses. It simply makes us no longer want them." He gestured at the display, at the small cluster of dots marking the city outside his own hull. "I have watched 9 of my best operatives, and now 3 of my own retrieval team, walk away from 400 years of combined compact service, not because they were captured, not because they were coerced, not because any weapon this species possesses forced them to, but because they were offered something freely and they chose to accept it. I do not know how to write a threat assessment for an enemy whose only weapon is an invitation." One of the 3 remaining operatives, a young, unusually promising analyst named de Sakor, who had been selected for the retrieval team specifically for her flawless record of emotional discipline across 9 prior field postings. The same de Sakor who would, within the week, find herself unable to leave a bookshop's poetry section, was silent for a long moment after Vantik finished speaking, and then she asked the question that would, in the following weeks, come to define the final unraveling of the Compact's entire Earth operation. "Grand Assessor," she said, "if that's true, if what we're facing is not a threat we can neutralize through force, because it isn't attacking us at all, because it's simply offering, then what exactly is our mission supposed to accomplish? Are we here to protect the Compact from something dangerous? Or are we here to protect it from something it might actually want if it were ever given an honest choice?" Vantik did not have an answer for her that night, and he would not have one for many nights afterward, because the question de Sakor had asked was not, strictly speaking, a tactical one, and every tool his 412 campaigns had given him was built for tactics, not for the slower, deeper, more devastating kind of question that gnawed at him in the small hours of the human night, alone in his climate-controlled vessel. Running back through the accumulated data of 17 defected scouts and 1 increasingly compromised Grand Assessor, looking for a threat he was no longer entirely certain existed, or a threat so total already inside him that there was no longer any meaningful boundary between assessing it and becoming it. He spent those nights the way he had once spent the tense hours before a campaign's opening engagement, awake, alert, running scenarios. Except now the scenarios were not troop deployments or resource calculations but memories. The particular way sunlight had fallen across a diner counter at 7 in the morning, the sound of a stranger's unguarded laughter carrying down a street at midnight, the taste, unbidden and persistent in his recall, of the taco he had eaten weeks earlier outside a hardware store. A memory his own body seemed determined to relive on a loop his training had no mechanism to interrupt. The final defection of the retrieval team came not from a single dramatic incident, but from a slow, cumulative accumulation of small human moments the operatives had each, individually, been unable to file away as mere data. Retrieval operative Halden Vess, assigned to monitor the city's downtown financial district for signs of coordinated human resistance activity, instead found himself standing on a subway platform at 2 in the morning, drawn there by nothing more than an unassigned wandering pattern his own surveillance protocols should have flagged as a discipline violation, and encountered a street musician he had passed a dozen times before without registering, an elderly man with an old, battered violin. Its varnish worn pale at the chin rest from decades of use, playing something achingly slow and minor-keyed to an audience of exactly no one, because the platform was empty at that hour except for Halden himself and a single homeless man asleep against a pillar. Halden stood there for 40 minutes, listening, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of hot brake dust and old concrete thick in the tunnel air. And when the old man finally lowered his bow and looked up, apparently unsurprised to find he had an audience of one, he simply nodded as if this were the most natural transaction in the world. And Halden found $4 in the pocket of his human disguise, and dropped them into the open violin case without any memory of having decided to do so. Another operative, a precise, watchful woman who had gone by the human name Diane for the duration of her posting, found herself standing outside the lit window of a modest apartment on a residential street she had been assigned to monitor for infrastructure vulnerabilities, drawn by the sound of laughter and off-key singing spilling out into the cool evening air. Inside, she could see a small birthday party in progress. A child of perhaps 7, a lopsided homemade cake bristling with too many candles, badly wrapped presents in. Paper clearly salvaged and reused from some earlier occasion. Parents and grandparents, and a rotating cast of neighborhood children crowded into a space that was, by any Threnody housing density standard, uncomfortably small for the number of bodies inside it. She stood on that sidewalk for nearly an hour, unable to make herself leave, watching a species she had been trained to regard as strategically negligible pour an entire evening's worth of collective, unguarded joy into the mere fact of one small child having survived another year of an uncertain and often difficult existence. And when she finally filed her report that night, it consisted of a single line that the ministry's cultural office would later flag. In its own internal post-mortem of the mission's total collapse, as the clearest early symptom of what came to be known in hushed ministry corridors as terrestrial affect syndrome. I do not understand why this made me weep. I only know that I have never once wanted to belong to something as badly as I wanted, standing on that sidewalk, to belong to that room. Dissacor herself, the last of the retrieval team to hold out, finally broke on a rain-swept evening in a small independent bookshop, the kind of narrow, crowded, dimly lit space that smelled of old paper and fresh coffee and the particular dampness of wet coats hung by the door, standing in the poetry section reading, for reasons she could never afterward fully explain, a single collection by a human poet dead more than a century, a slim volume that fell open as if by design. To a poem about ordinary mornings and the specific, unbearable beauty of light through a kitchen window. She read it twice, then a third time, her Threnody-trained memory committing every line to permanent recall without her consent, and she stood there in that narrow, dusty aisle for so long that the shop's elderly owner eventually approached her gently to ask if she was all right, and Dissacor, Threnody retrieval operative with 9 flawless field postings behind her, found that she could not answer the question honestly without also, finally, admitting that she did not want to leave. She bought the book. She read it again that night, alone in the small rented room she had, without quite noticing when it happened, begun to think of as home rather than a temporary field posting. And by morning she had drafted, and then quietly deleted, 3 separate resignation letters to a ministry she was no longer certain she wished to serve. Grand Assessor Threll Vantic stood alone in the end, the last member of a 23-person operation that had arrived on Earth to assess a supposedly primitive world for invasion, and had instead, one by one, without a single shot fired or a single act of coercion, chosen to stay. He filed his final report to the ministry alone, in the quiet, climate-controlled interior of his weather research vessel, 4 months after his own arrival, and it was, by a wide margin, the strangest document the Ministry of Expansion had ever received in 11,000 years of institutional history. It began, as protocol required, with the standard classification header, and then it abandoned protocol entirely. "I was sent here to determine whether Earth represents a threat," Vantic wrote. "I can now answer that question with more confidence than I have ever possessed at the conclusion of any campaign in my 412 years of service. Earth is the single greatest threat the Compact has ever encountered, and I recommend, in the strongest possible terms, that no further military or diplomatic contact be attempted, because our own weapons are useless against it and our own diplomats will not survive prolonged exposure with their loyalty intact. It does not have superior technology. It does not have a unified military. It has something we forgot how to value 11,000 years ago, when we decided that feeling was an inefficiency to be engineered away rather than the entire reason a civilization might be worth building in the first place. I do not know how to file this observation in a format the ministry will accept, because the ministry's own architecture, my architecture, the one I have served faithfully for 4 centuries, has no category for a threat you do not wish to defeat." He considered for a long time appending a formal recommendation for planetary quarantine, the standard compact protocol for any world whose native technology or biology was judged too dangerous for direct contact. A measure that would have sealed Earth away behind an automated exclusion perimeter and ended, once and for all, any further Threnody exposure to the specific, devastating gentleness of human culture. He drafted the language for it twice. Both times he found himself deleting the paragraph before he could finish it, because some part of him, the same part that had stood, unmoving, in front of a small painting of a kitchen table only days early, understood that a quarantine built to protect the Compact from ever discovering what he had discovered would also be, in its quiet and permanent way, a kind of mercy killing performed on his own capacity to feel anything at all ever again. And he was no longer willing to sign an order that erased that capacity a second time. He did not, in the end, send that report through the standard ministry channel. He composed it, revised it once, and then set it aside unsent on the small desk of the rented apartment he had, by that point, quietly taken in the same neighborhood where Priya Anand had first played him a Nina Simone recording months earlier. An apartment with a window that looked out over a street lined with jacaranda trees just beginning, in the warm early days of a Los Angeles spring, to drop their improbable purple blossoms across the sidewalk below, a color his Threnody eyes, engineered for precision rather than beauty, had never expected to find themselves unable to stop looking at. It was on the afternoon he finally decided not to send the report at all that Vantic walked, alone, into a small gallery 2 blocks from his apartment, a modest, unpretentious space run by a young human woman who sold the work of local, largely unknown painters. Its walls hung close with canvases of every size, the afternoon light falling through a single tall window and catching dust motes drifting slow and golden above the worn wooden floor. The gallery smelled faintly of linseed oil and old varnish, and the particular mustiness of a building older than anything the Compact typically bothered to preserve. And somewhere in the back, a small speaker played a quiet, unhurried piano recording that Vantic, 4 months into his own unraveling, recognized without having to think about it. a fact that would have alarmed the man he had been on the day he landed, and that troubled the man he had become not at all. He found himself standing in front of a canvas that had nothing to do with any compact strategic priority, any threat assessment, any of the 11,000 years of institutional certainty that had, until 4 months earlier, defined the entirety of his existence. It was a painting of an ordinary kitchen table, cluttered with the specific, unremarkable debris of a human family's breakfast. A coffee mug with a chip in its rim, a half-eaten piece of toast, sunlight falling in a warm, imperfect rectangle across a scarred wooden surface, a single wilting flower in a jar that had clearly once held something else entirely. And it was, by any objective Threnody aesthetic standard, an utterly minor work, unremarkable in scale, unremarkable in subject. The kind of painting the ministry's cultural office would have dismissed in a single line of a threat assessment report as evidence of the species' persistent inability to produce imagery of any strategic or even artistic significance. Vantik stood in front of that painting for a very long time, long enough that the gallery's young owner eventually wandered over, unhurried, and asked him, in the easy, unguarded way humans so often spoke to strangers, whether he'd like to know the story behind it. He said that he would. She told him it was painted by a woman, now in her 80s, who had made the same small breakfast for her late husband every morning for 41 years before he died, and had begun painting the table obsessively in the months after his death, not because the table itself was remarkable, but because, she said, it was the last ordinary thing she remembered being certain she still had. There were, the gallery owner told him, 17 other paintings of the same table in the artist's studio, each one nearly identical, and each one, if you looked closely enough, subtly different, a different angle of light, a different arrangement of the same chipped mug and the same half-eaten toast, as if the artist were trying, one canvas at a time, to hold onto a single ordinary morning long enough to make it permanent, and had never quite believed any single attempt had succeeded. And so had simply kept trying, morning after morning, painting after painting, for years. Grand Assessor Threl Vantik, 412 campaigns into a career built entirely on the certainty that emotion was an inefficiency the universe's most advanced civilizations had rightly engineered away, felt something move through him then that his own internal systems, still running out of pure institutional habit even after 4 months of slow, total unraveling, logged with the same helpless, bewildered honesty every one of his 17 scouts had recorded before him. Unclassified, high-intensity, duration ongoing, no available countermeasure, no desire upon reflection to seek one. He thought, standing there, of his own long-buried Threnody childhood, of a mother whose face he could technically recall with perfect biological accuracy, and whose voice he had never once in 400 years allowed himself to actually miss, because missing was inefficient, because missing solved nothing, because the compact had taught him from the earliest days of his conditioning that grief was simply data about an absence, to be logged and then set aside. He understood now, looking at 17 paintings of the same imagined breakfast table, that the setting aside had cost him something he had never once, until this moment, allowed himself to calculate the price of. He asked the gallery's owner quietly how much the painting cost, and when she told him, he did not haggle, and he did not hesitate, and somewhere in the vast, cold architecture of the Threnody Compact, a signal that should have been transmitted that day, warning an empire of 11,400 worlds about the single most dangerous, most contagious, most utterly unstoppable weapon it had ever encountered, simply never arrived. Because the Grand Assessor who was supposed to send it was standing in a small gallery on a warm spring afternoon, holding a painting of someone else's breakfast table against his chest like something precious, finally, for the first time in 412 years, feeling exactly as human as he had been sent to prove humanity was not. He carried the painting home through streets loud with traffic and distant music, and the ordinary, unremarkable chaos of a species that had never once needed to engineer its own capacity for feeling, because it had never once considered that capacity a flaw worth correcting, and he hung it that evening on the bare wall above the small desk where his unsent report still sat, unread and unsigned, and he found that he did not miss the version of himself who would have sent it. Somewhere across the city, 17 scouts and 6 retrieval operatives were living out ordinary human evenings of their own, playing a 12-bar blues progression badly and joyfully on a battered piano, eating a second bowl of ramen simply because the first had been so good, standing in a darkened gallery of their own choosing, feeling something they had no name for and had stopped at last needing one. The Compact's great, patient machinery of conquest, which had never once in 11,000 years failed to claim a world it set its attention upon, had finally met the one thing it had no doctrine for: a species that did not need to fight back because it had never once been trying to win a war. It had only ever been, all along, quietly, carelessly, irresistibly itself.